Hey everyone, let's talk books. And today what I have is my March and April recap. So this is all the books that I read in March and April. So let's see. It's been a super stressful time, so I didn't do as much reading as I would have liked. Especially in March when I read like 3 books, which is not my norm. Even on my busy months, I usually read a little bit more than that. But anyway, let's just get to it because I do have quite a bit of books. I did a lot better in April. So the first book that I finished up in March, and I'll put it up because what I realized is that most of the books that I read in March and April were ebooks or were library books and have now been returned. So I'll be putting images up. The first book was Her Last Breath. It was by Linda Castillo, and this was a recommendation from Jessie Shelf here on YouTube, but I'll go ahead and link her below. This is like the 8th or 9th book in a series. I did not realize it was a series when I first read it, but it is something that's grabbed me, and I have since purchased basically the whole series. It is basically Murder in Amish Country. And I was really quite intrigued. I haven't really read much books about Amish country, and I'm really into kind of mystery, crime, thriller books right now, and this was right up the alley. I'm going to give it 3.5, maybe 4 stars. I think I gave it 4 on Goodreads because it was a really great book up until the end. I kind of didn't like the end, but I really liked getting to know the characters, and I think maybe because this was the first book I read in the series, that was kind of what grabbed me, that these were interesting characters, the detectives really flawed and interesting and all that, so it grabbed me, so that so that's what I'll say. It was not a perfect book, but it was good enough that it grabbed me and made me want to read the whole series. Leave it at that. All right, the next book I read was a graphic novel. It was Persepolis. This is a book about an Iranian girl. She's in Iran during the revolution, and it goes through, it's just really well done. This is a book that I'd been wanting to read for years and years. There was a period in which all of my French teacher friends were reading it and signing it and all of that, and because it was published in France first, I believe. But you're seeing it through the eyes of a child, right? You're seeing a revolution through the eyes of a child, and you're seeing how bombing affects families, how it affects individuals, how it affects kids, and how the swing of politics has an effect. And it's really, really well done. It's easily accessible. The graphic novel format is brilliant. The artistry in the illustrations is perfect. It was just a really brilliant book. There's a whole series of these, so I only read the very first part, and I think at some point I will pick up the rest and finish up the story of this woman, so because it's a real life story. All right, next book I read was Beneath the Starlight Sky, a novel by Mark Sullivan, and I read this on ebook. I had a couple months where I did the Kindle Unlimited, and this was part of the Kindle Unlimited, so free, great. And it's set in World War II in Italy, which is not a setting that's very typical. Typical books about World War II are set in Western Italy is in Western Europe, but it's more common to read books that are set in like France or Germany, and Italy gets left out quite a bit, so that's why it intrigued me. Somebody in my book club had mentioned that they were reading it, and I was like, oh, set in Italy, that's really interesting. So I think I gave it 3 stars, maybe 2. And Persepolis, by the way, was 5 stars, but Beneath the Scarlet Sky had a really great premise. World War II, Italy, that's something that like checks off a lot of my boxes. But I felt like the author went and interviewed the guy that the story is based on, the gentleman, and he has an amazing story. And I think the author was trying to stay really true to the story and the way the story was told to him. which is great in a history book, but this was a work of fiction, and I felt like at times he was putting a lot of emphasis on elements that weren't that interesting, and then things that were supposed to have a big emotional impact were just skimmed over. And last bit of the book, I would say that probably the last, I don't know, fourth or a third of the book really picks up, because that's when the Allies are making their way through Italy. It's very clear who's going to win, and there's a lot happening, right? And it's like every decision, small or big, has a significant impact. And then you get to see American troops there, and the aftermath or not the aftermath, but basically the very end of the war. And I think that's one of the things that I've been trying to do a better job in my history classes of emphasizing it. That just because the Allies are coming in did not mean things went back to normal, everything is great. There's a moment at the end of the war in which it's very chaotic, it's still very violent, the nightmare does not end. It kind of shifts a little, but it doesn't end. So there's still a lot of pain and suffering in the immediate aftermath of the war. And this novel did a really great job of just giving you a visual of all of that. So for anybody interested in World War II, I would recommend it. Just as a novel, though, I would not. Like, if you're not interested in this at all, I think there are better books on World War II. So I will move on. I have a lot of thoughts to say on history books, because if you don't know, I do have a PhD in European history, specifically in French history. Alright, so the next book that I read is In the Midst of Winter by Isabel Allende. This is my first Isabel Allende book, and I did read it for my book club. So it was really... it was a great read for me. The story is of a Chilean woman. She's in the U.S. She's a professor. She's like on a visiting professor position for a year. And she's living with a colleague that has offered basically the downstairs of like his New York place. They're in the middle of like this terrible blizzard in New York, and he needs to go out and take one of his cats to the vet, because the cat's like ingested poison in the house. On his way back, he hits a car. And it's this young woman from Honduras, I believe, and she like freaks out and disappears. Later on in the day, she basically tracks him down because he'd given her his card because he's trying to do the responsible thing, and it's like, my insurance will pay for everything, no problem. It turns out she's got a dead body in her trunk. So there's a bit of that mystery thing, but the best part about this book is not that mystery of what happens, why this body got there, which you do find out in the end. It's more about the story of these two women, and even the guy. So part of the story is the story of Lucia Maras, and so it's a narrative in which takes place, part of it is that... Sorry. My dogs are going a little crazy. Hey! They're trying to be included. Stop it, guys. Stop it. Stop it. Okay, Lucia Maras, she's a Chilean professor, and she has been through the violence in Chile, where people would just disappear. You get a military coup, and you end up with people who just disappear because they were against the regime. They were socialists, communists, basically anybody who says anything negative about the regime or is connected to someone disappeared. Her brother had disappeared, and her mother just basically becomes stuck in the idea that she knows her son is dead, but there's no body. So without a body, mourning is very difficult, and she can't accept that her son's dead even though she knows he's dead, right? It's a really emotional story. In the story, the young woman is Evelyn Ortega, and she's not from Honduras, she's from Guatemala, and she's from like this village in Guatemala where her mom has left. Her mom is in the U.S. and sends them money, so it's her brothers, and her grandmother so the grandma is raising them, but violence begins to erupt in Guatemala, and kind of one of the brothers is sucked into the gang warfare, and as a result, things are unsafe for Evelyn in Guatemala. So she ends up fleeing Guatemala, going through Mexico to make her way up to the U.S. And that was the hardest story for me to read. I'm an immigrant. I come from an immigrant family, and like, I know all those stories, they're not new to me, but it's still really hard to read. You know, it's really hard when you know people that have gone through some of that, because you get like her experience of being in Mexico and not having enough to eat, not being able to get help, making it to the border, and the dangers that come with trying to cross the border. Then the gentleman in the story is Richard Browmaster, a 60-year-old human rights scholar, and his seemed like the least interesting story in the whole book up until the end, when you realize like he'd had a whole life in, I think it was Brazil, and a wife, a kid, and that's all I can say without spoiling too much. I don't know. It was just one of those books that I'm like, it's just really emotional, and I think I gave it 4 stars just because there's a few things I didn't like in the story. But I do recommend it. I think it's a very good book. It was the first Isabel Allende book I've read, and I will read at some point more of her books, because I find she does a really good job of weaving stories together and telling kind of one narrative as a whole. So I really, really enjoyed that. The next book I read was the book club book for April. It was for April. It is The Power by Naomi Alderman. And I gave this one 3 stars on Goodreads because, alright, so the premise is that all of a sudden, it begins with girls, and then basically every woman on the planet has the power to, like, has electricity in her hands, so they can like electrocute or send currents out from their hands, so that, and you know, harm other people. And the premise is that what does this do to gender roles and to the gender power dynamics all over the world, when women all of a sudden basically have more physical power than men. And it takes you're following several stories. It's like something like 4 different stories of these girls and one man, and basically what happens to them. It is a very dark book. I was not prepared for how dark this book was going to get, and I read it in 2 sittings, and so I don't recommend doing that. I think this is a book that's an intellectual exercise. It's like, oh, okay, what happens to the world when this happens? So you want to be like intellectually examining it, rather than just kind of absorbing all the darkness in it. I also fundamentally disagree with part of the premise, right? Because kind of one of the takeaways from the book, it's called The Power. So it's about power corrupting, right? That power corrupts people, and that as a historian, I just fundamentally disagree about some of the things that are explored about what happens when women come to power. There have been societies in which that have been matriarchal, right, where women have been in power, and what we know of them does not mean that men held second-class citizenship places. Like, they were not mistreated at a institutional level, right? Matriarchal societies seem to have had more equal societies, and so some of the stuff that happens in The Power, I just think like it just felt a little outlandish to me. Obviously, bad things would happen whenever someone has things shift in power dynamics. Bad things will happen, and some of the stuff felt really realistic. There are a bunch of chapters about religion, because you end up following what ends up really becoming the founder of a new religion, and that stuff did feel really realistic to me. Like, yeah, all of a sudden if women have like electrical power, it's going to shift religious ideas. It really, like it would. Those were probably some of my least favorite chapters. Actually, the religious ones, because I think they just went on too long. Like that story, like played itself out halfway through the book for me. But some of the other stuff was interesting about, politics, and what happens when, like, this, especially in countries in which women have very little power, places like Saudi Arabia, or places in which there's already warfare, and then the power dynamics totally shift. Some of that was interesting, and some of it I didn't agree with. And trigger warnings for sexual assault, violence. So this is not a happy book. Anyways, I got a lot to say about it, clearly. So after reading that book, I really did not need anything that smart. I was like, no, I don't need anything that dark. So I read Size 12 is Not Fat by Meg Cabot, which is a book that another one of the ladies in my book club book had recommended like way last year. It'd been on my TBR, and I finally just checked it out from the library and ebook. So this was a really fun book. And first of all, size 12 is not fat. I'm size 12. But it follows the story of Heather Wells, and it turns out this is a book in a series, and this is the first one. And they're mystery books. But the main character is Heather Wells, and she's like an ex-teen pop star that has lost her fortune and is no longer singing. And instead, she is one of the administrators at a residence hall, right? And then there's a murder. Well, everybody thinks it's an accident in the residence hall, and she kind of begins seeing some things that don't fit, and then there's a second accident in which a young girl dies, and it turns out it is murder, and it's her kind of putting the pieces together. But, okay, this is not like a detective story. She's not a detective. She does live with a PI, and who's the brother of her ex-fiance, who's also a pop star. And she's in love with the brother now, with the guy she lives with. So that was a fun little twist. There is some of this like a little bit of romance in there, and so it's kind of fun to follow her around and kind of see the way she pieces things together. And she's dealing with having put on weight and being in this like, her life's been turned upside down, and it was kind of fun. It was a fun mystery. Nothing great, that exciting. I think I gave it 4 stars because it was just what I needed at the right time, right place. I liked it. The next book I read was book 5 in the In Death series by J.D. Robb or Nora Roberts. This one was Ceremony in Death, and it's been a while since I picked up an in-death book, but this was fun. It was fun. I really like following Detective Eve Dallas. She's a no-nonsense, super smart, tough cop, and this one involves cults and kind of magic. If you don't know, the series takes place like in the future in like 1248 or something, and she is married to one of the richest men in the world, and their relationship is one of the things that I think makes this series really interesting. So one, if you're not into like sex scenes, this might not be the book for you. This one didn't have as many as some of the other books, but there are sex scenes between her and her husband because they have a healthy relationship in which there's sex, and I think that's one of the pluses in the book, the way they have been dealing with the relationship between these two people, that it's not all about like, oh, will they, won't they. No, they're married and they have a good relationship, not without some issues, but good relationship. So anyways, the mysteries, like following this cult thing and whether there's actually magic in the world, and how this like cult of devil worshippers has been responsible for a few murders that have been ruled like accidental. So another kind of like just pulpy, fun book. I really enjoy reading it. March, I am still in kind of the pulpy, like I want books that are just easy to read. I'm going to require a lot of mental intellect, because it's the end of the semester. I have a lot of grading to do. I have things to still finish up. The end of the semester is hell, not just for students, but also for your professors. We're all human, and I'm kind of trying to get through it as well. But I will be through it soon, so I expect to read a whole lot more in the month of May. I'm not going to do a TBR because the first half of May is just going to be taken up by grading and the end of the semester stuff. But in the second half of May, I think I'm just going to devour a ton of books, and I'm not sure where my mood's going to be. It's kind of hard to predict where you are going to be mentally and emotionally at the end of the semester, so we'll see where it takes me. But I'll come back at the end of May and share the books I've been reading. That is it for me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.